Melanie Harrington woke up on the morning of September 28, 2023, her chest heavy with a grief that never fully left her. Outside the window, the sky hung thick and gray, mirroring the sorrow that had quietly governed her life for nearly 3 decades. She reached toward the nightstand, blindly fumbling for her reading glasses, then turned her attention to the small mirror above her dresser. Hanging at the center, suspended by a faded ribbon, was a photo she had looked at nearly every day for the last 27 years. A close-up of her daughter, Emily, wearing her 5th-grade school uniform, her smile so bright and trusting. Melanie took the photo carefully, as if it might crumble from the weight of memory. Her throat tightened. "Emily," she whispered, the name catching in her voice. Tears gathered in her eyes, but she inhaled deeply, pushing back the sobs. There would be time to cry later. There always was. But for now, she needed to hold herself together. She had made it through 27 of these anniversaries, each one an unbearable milestone, but she had learned to compartmentalize the anguish, to carry it without letting it consume her. After washing her face and getting dressed, Melanie checked her phone. A single message awaited her. It was from her longtime friend, Angela Reynolds. "You're not alone in this. We still remember. If you want company, come over anytime." Angela, too, had lost a child that day. Her daughter Lily had been Emily's best friend. Melanie texted back immediately, asking if now would be a good time to come over. Angela's response was swift and warmly affirmative. Before leaving, Melanie made a small detour into her kitchen. She grabbed a few packets of Earl Grey lavender tea and a glass jar of homemade oatmeal cookies. It felt wrong to show up empty-handed, especially to Angela, who had stood beside her through the worst years of her life. As she stepped out into the chilled autumn air, Melanie tightened her coat and began the short walk to Angela's house. The streets looked nearly the same as they had in 1996, the year everything changed. Children's bicycles lay strewn on lawns, jack-o'-lanterns decorated porches, and wind chimes tinkled faintly in the breeze. She could still recall walking Emily down these same sidewalks on school mornings, her tiny hand swinging in hers. The house Angela shared with her husband Robert was just 3 blocks away. When Melanie reached the gate, the front door opened before she had a chance to knock. Angela stood in the doorway, her face lined with years of pain but softened with empathy. Without a word, she stepped forward and enveloped Melanie in a long embrace. "Come in," she said quietly, meeting her inside. Melanie handed over the tea and cookies with a grateful smile, and they moved into the kitchen, where Angela set about boiling water. Melanie settled into the living room couch, absorbing the familiarity of her surroundings. So much of her life had faded, but this space, this bond, remained. "How are you doing?" Angela asked gently as the kettle began to hiss. Melanie exhaled slowly, her eyes fixed on the steam curling up from the cups. "Trying to keep it together. You know how this day is?" She hesitated, her fingers tracing a pattern into the hem of her sleeve. "Even after all these years, the grief doesn't dull. It just changes." Angela nodded. "I know. Same for me. I finished therapy last year, and it helped. I don't spiral as much anymore, but today is always different." She paused. "Sometimes I wonder if I need to go back." Melanie said nothing for a moment, sipping her tea, the fragrant breathing briefing evilly left in the knot in her chest. "I've never really left it," she admitted. "I don't go to sessions anymore, but it's always with me, the wondering, the what-ifs." Silence fell between them, not awkward but dense with shared history. Outside, a breeze rustled the brittle leaves. Inside, the house felt like a sanctuary, guarded by the ghosts of 2 mothers' Basilians. Angela reached for a nearby photo album. "Want to look at some old pictures?" she asked, her voice cautious. Melanie hesitated, then nodded. "I think I'm ready." They sat side by side, flipping through the pages. Photos of birthday parties, school plays, family barbecues, moments frozen in time, evidence of laughter and innocence before the storm. When Melanie turned to a picture of Emily and Lily in their school uniforms on their first day of 5th grade, her breath caught. "I was so excited that day," she said, brushing her fingertips over the glossy print. The school had only opened 2 years earlier. Just 6 kids in their grade back then. Angela smiled faintly. "Yeah, by the end of the year it had grown to 15. Remember the discounts they offered to attract more students? Of course. Emily loved that place, Melanie replied. It felt like a second home. She turned the page and froze. Her eyes landed on a photo she didn't recognize. It showed Emily, Lily, and several classmates working on a science project. Behind them, partially visible, was a yellow school bus. "Where did you get this?" she asked, her voice suddenly tight. Angela glanced over. "That one came from the police files. They let parents collect some of the materials after the case was closed. I went and requested everything they had." Melanie blinked. "I didn't know we could do that." Angela offered a sad smile. "It wasn't really publicized. To be honest, having all those files, it didn't help me heal. I stayed up nights searching them for answers. I thought maybe I'd find something everyone else missed." Melanie's gaze returned to the photo. Something felt off. A shadow stirred in her mind, a whisper of misalignment. She leaned closer, squinting at a familiar face standing at the far edge of the group, someone she had never been told was on the trip. "Angela," she said, pointing, "is that Principal Daniels?" Angela's brow furrowed interest. "It might be. I thought only Mr. Thompson and a support staff member went with them." "That's what I remember too," Melanie said slowly. "But if Marcia Daniels was there—" Her voice trailed off, overtaken by a surge of emotion she couldn't name. Angela touched her arm gently. "Mel, I know that look. Please don't get your hopes up. We've done this before, seen things, thought they meant something. It always ends the same." Melanie bit her lip and nodded, but her heart pounded. This photo, this one detail, it didn't belong, and yet it was there. A forgotten thread in the tapestry of tragedy, pulling at the edges of everything she thought she knew. And somewhere, deep inside, something had just shifted. Melanie couldn't take her eyes off the photograph. The image of Principal Marcia Daniels standing beside the children, her posture formal yet strangely distant, stirred something deep and unsettling within her. She had always believed, as had all the parents, that it was Mr. Thompson, the homeroom teacher and a support staff member, who accompanied the class on that trip. That fact had been repeated in police reports, during the hearings, even at the memorial services. So why was Marcia in this picture? She turned to Angela, her voice strained. "Do you remember anyone ever saying Marcia went with them?" Angela took the album, squinting at the photo. "I mean, I heard whispers. Some parents said she might have been there, but no one ever confirmed it. I thought it was just rumors." Melanie's hands trembled as she gently closed the album. Her mind was spinning. Could something like this go unnoticed for so long? I was at every meeting, every court session. If Marcia had gone, someone would have said something. Why wasn't this brought up back then? Angela placed a hand on Melanie's arm. "We were all so overwhelmed. Maybe people just assumed, or maybe the truth was lost in all the chaos." Melanie shook her head slowly. "Or maybe it was hidden." Angela sighed, a familiar weariness in her expression. "Mel, I know this feels important, but I've been down that road. I spent nights chasing details that didn't go anywhere. It almost broke me. Please be careful." Melanie nodded, though her thoughts were elsewhere. She glanced at the clock and realized she had go, she said softly. "I should go," she said softly, rising from the couch. "I want to stop by the cemetery, visit Emily." Angela stood as well. "Do you want company? Robert and I were going to visit Lily's grave later, but I could come now." Melanie smiled, appreciating the offer, but she knew Angela preferred to go with her husband. "Thank you, but I'll be okay." As she gathered her things, she hesitated. "Would it be all right if I took that photo with me? The one with the school bus?" Angela looked uncertain for a moment, then nodded. "Of course. But Mel, promise me something. Don't let it consume you again. We can't go back to that place." "I won't," Melanie promised, though even as the words left her lips, she wasn't sure she could keep them. The moment she stepped outside, the chill in the air seemed sharper, more alert. She clutched the photo close to her chest, walking toward the nearest bus stop. As the bus rolled through the streets of Flagstaff, Arizona, Melanie stared at the image, trying to make sense of it. Marcia Daniels's presence in that photo wasn't just a fluke. It was a discrepancy in the official narrative, and in Melanie's heart, that meant something. The bus came to a slow stop at an intersection not far from where she remembered Marcia once lived. She hadn't planned to do anything impulsive, but when the familiar street name caught her eye, her body moved before her brain could catch up. She hit the bum and stepped off the bus. The neighborhood was quiet, tucked behind aging trees and weathered fences. She walked slowly, her eyes scanning for signs of familiarity. Several houses had been remodeled over the years, but eventually one stood out, a neat white home with trimmed hedges and a small flower garden. A blue sedan sat in the driveway. Melanie's heart quickened. She stood at the edge of the sidewalk, uncertain. Maybe Marcia had moved, maybe she wasn't even home, maybe this was all pointless. But then the front door creaked open and two women emerged, one older, one much younger. Melanie immediately recognized the older woman, despite the passage of time. Maria Daniels looked almost exactly as she had 27 years ago, only now her face bore the weight of decades past. Her eyes met Melanie's and faltered. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone polite but wary. Melanie swallowed hard. "I'm Melanie Harrington, Emily's mother." The name struck like a blow. Marcia's expression shifted instantly, her eyes wide with a recognition she couldn't mask. "Oh," she stammered, "give me a moment." She turned to the younger woman beside her. "Why don't you go on inside and make yourself comfortable?" The young woman, likely in her 30s, gave Melanie a curious glance before stepping into the house. Marcia fumbled with her keys, clearly shaken. Melanie waited on the porch, her mind racing. Once the door closed, Marcia turned back. "Forgive me, I wasn't expecting visitors. What brings you here after all these years?" "I have a question," Melanie said calmly, though her pulse roared in her ears. "About the trip." Marcia's face tightened. "I'm not the principal anymore. I retired years ago. I'm not sure how much help I can be." Melanie pulled the photo from her bag and held it out. "Was this taken at school or on the trip?" Marcia took the photo, her eyes scanning it slowly. For a moment, she said nothing. Then she replied, "It was during the trip." A second passed. No, sorry. I meant it was taken at the school parking lot, before they left." Melanie narrowed her eyes. "Were you on the trip, Marcia?" The older woman blinked. "No, I stayed behind. Mr. Thompson and the admin staff member went. I had to handle something urgent at the school that day." Melanie nodded slowly, filing away every word, every pause. "Do you remember anything unusual about Mr. Thompson that day?" Marcia's tone shifted, defensiveness. "I've answered that question so many times. I gave my statements. I never suspected him. I don't want to reopen that pain, Mrs. Harrington. I truly don't." Melanie felt her resolve falter just for a moment. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "I just can't stop wondering what happened. We never got answers." A silence settled between them. Then Marcia softened. "I understand. That's why I left the school. I couldn't bear the memories." She stepped forward and gently hugged Melanie. "Today must be so hard for you." Melanie was stunned by the sudden warmth. "Thank you," she whispered. As she turned to leave, she glanced once more at the house. Through the partially open door, she saw the young woman standing in the hallway, watching. There was something familiar in her gaze, something that made Melanie's breath catch. She said nothing as she walked down the steps, clutching the photo tightly. But inside her, a new question had formed, one she couldn't ignore. Who was that woman? And why did she seem so familiar? Melanie walked briskly toward the bus stop, the photograph clutched tightly in her coat pocket. Her breath came out in short, visible puffs, though whether from the chill in the air or the adrenaline coursing through her veins, she couldn't say. As she waited, her eyes kept drifting back to the street she'd just left, to the modest white house where she'd seen Principal Marcia Daniels and the mysterious young woman. That woman's face lingered in her mind, her posture, her eyes, that flicker of something unspoken. The door had closed behind her quickly, but not before Melanie had caught the unmistakable glimmer of recognition. She had seen that face before, somewhere, but where? The bus pulled up with a squeal of brakes, and Melanie climbed aboard, sinking into a seat near the window. Her mind was a whirlpool of memories and fragmented impressions. She had gone there to ask about a photo, a long-forgotten image of a class long vanished. But what she had found was more than an inconsistency. It was a feeling. An instinct she couldn't shake. She pressed the photo against her lap, smoothing it out and studying it again. Marcia Daniels stood beside the school bus, her hand resting on the frame, her gaze angled toward the children, toward Emily. Melanie stared until the photo blurred before her eyes. She blinked rapidly, forcing herself to focus. If Marcia had truly been at the school and not on the trip, then why lie? Why hesitate? And more importantly, who was that woman in her house? As the bus trundled toward the town center, Melanie's phone buzzed in her bag. She pulled it out, glancing at the screen. No new messages, no missed calls. A part of her had hoped she'd hear from Officer Jensen, the detective who had handled the original case. She still had his number saved, though she hadn't used it in years. Her thumb hovered over the contact. Would he even remember her? Did it matter? She couldn't shake the nagging thought that the photo was important, that it held a clue, perhaps one they had all overlooked. She hit call, the phone pressed tightly to her ear. One ring, two, then voicemail. She didn't leave a message. She wasn't sure what she would say. The bus hit another stop, jerking slightly, and Melanie looked up, only to realize she was near the old neighborhood where Marcia had once lived during the school years. Without thinking, she rang the bell again and stepped off the bus, murmuring an apology to the driver. She stood on the sidewalk, uncertain of what had come over her. There was no plan, no destination, just a feeling. Her feet began to move on their own, carrying her down streets she hadn't walked in decades. The neighborhood was familiar, but time had done its work. New paint on some houses, overgrown yards on others. But the deeper she walked, the more her steps slowed until they came to a stop in front of a house that felt like a memory. The hedges were neatly trimmed, the flowers blooming in symmetrical rows, a blue car in the driveway. Something about the symmetry, the order, it unsettled her. It was too perfect, too curated, as if someone had something to hide. Melanie stood at the edge of the walkway, debating whether to approach. Before she could decide, the front door opened again. Two women stepped out, one older, one younger. Time seemed to freeze. Melanie recognized Marcia instantly, even as the former principal's features sagged with age. But it was the younger woman who made her breath catch in her throat. That face, that expression, it was unmistakable. The woman looked directly at Melanie before quickly averting her gaze. She turned toward the house and stepped inside without a word. Melanie followed, glancing back briefly. Melanie raised her hand, caught in hesitation. Should she call out? Follow? But then the door clicked shut, and the moment was gone. Melanie stood on the sidewalk, unsure what to do. A bus wouldn't arrive for another 20 minutes. She checked her phone again. No messages, no response. Her fingers trembled as she debated calling Officer Jensen once more, but instead she slid the phone back into her bag and started walking. Might as well try while I'm here, she muttered to herself. House after house passed by, none familiar enough to warrant a pause, but then, as she rounded a corner, she spotted a small group of homes near the edge of the block. One of them triggered a flicker of memory. It was the same one where a PTA meeting had once been held. Emily had tagged along, sitting quietly in the living room with Lily while the parents argued over budgets and field trips. Melanie approached cautiously. The yard was pristine, the driveway emptied now. She stepped up onto the porch, her heart hammering. Before she could knock, the door opened slightly. Marcia stood there, her expression unreadable. "Mrs. Harrington," she said. "I'm sorry, but this really isn't a good time." Melanie didn't flinch. "I'm not here to cause trouble, I just have questions." Marcia sighed and opened the door a little wider. "Please, come in, but only for a moment." Melanie entered the foyer, her eyes scanning the space. The home was neat, almost obsessively so. A faint scent of lavender hung in the air. The young woman was nowhere in sight. Marcia led her to a small sitting room and gestured for her to sit. "What do you want to know?" she asked, already bracing herself. Melanie pulled out the photograph again. "You said you weren't on the trip? But this photo suggests otherwise." Marcia looked at it, her eyes lingering on the edges. "I already told you, it was taken in the parking lot, before the bus departed." "That's not what you said it was," Melanie replied. "At first you said it was during the trip." Marcia hesitated, then straightened. "I misspoke. Did you?" Melanie leaned forward. "Marcia, please, I need the truth. My daughter was on that bus. I have a right to know." A long silence stretched between them. Then Marcia's voice softened. We all suffered losses that day. I thought I was helping by stepping back, by letting the authorities handle everything." "And what about that woman?" Melanie asked, her voice rising slightly. "The one I saw with you earlier? Who is she?" Marcia's eyes flicked toward the hallway. "She's just someone I help care for. She's been through a lot." "Is she one of them?" Melanie's voice trembled. "One of the students?" Marcia's face paled. "No, that's not possible." But the hesitation had returned. The lie was too neat, too rehearsed. Melanie stood. "I think I should go." Marcia nodded, her face unreadable once more. "Be well, Mrs. Harrington." Outside, the sun was starting to dip behind the horizon, casting long shadows over the sidewalk. Melanie clutched her bag and began the walk back to the bus stop. Her heart was racing, her mind spinning with questions. That woman in the house, she was hiding something. And Marcia was helping her. But why? The walk back to the bus stop was a blur of color and sound that barely registered in Melanie's consciousness. Her thoughts were consumed with the face of that young woman, the way she had looked at her, the fleeting moment of recognition in her eyes before she disappeared into the house. The more Melanie turned it over in her mind, the stronger her conviction grew. This wasn't a coincidence. She was someone connected. She arrived at the florist just as the light drizzle began, the overhang of the shop providing a small refuge from the weather. The familiar scent of blooms and soil greeted her as she stepped inside. Sarah, the florist, looked up with a gentle smile. "Mrs. Harrington, good to see you. I was wondering if you'd be stopping by today." Melanie nodded, trying to compose herself. "Yes, I'm here for the usual." As Sarah moved to prepare the bouquet, Melanie wandered to the display window, absently watching the raindrops streak down the glass. Her mind wasn't on flowers. It was still back at Marcia's house. She barely noticed when the shop bell chimed again, signaling a new customer. "Melanie?" came a familiar voice. She turned to see Angela and her husband Robert stepping inside. Angela's eyes quickly scanned Melanie's face, her expression shifting to concern. "I thought you'd already been to the cemetery," she said gently. "I got sidetracked," Melanie replied, her voice quieter than she intended. Robert approached and shook her hand warmly. "Good to see you. You holding up okay?" Melanie nodded. "As best I can," Sarah returned with the flowers, and Melanie moved to the counter. She arranged the bouquet herself, as she did every year, carefully placing each stem with practiced precision. Her hands moved automatically, but her mind wandered. Should she tell Angela what had happened? What she had seen? Before she could decide, Angela came to stand beside her. "That's beautiful," she said softly. Emily would have loved it. Melanie felt a sudden swell of emotion rise in her chest. "Angela," she said hesitantly, "there's something I need to tell you." Angela turned toward her, eyes searching her face. "What is it?" Melanie took a breath, trying to keep her voice steady. "After I left your house, I went to see Marcia Daniels." Angela blinked, surprised. "You did what? Why?" Melanie hesitated. "I don't know, I guess I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about that photo." I needed to ask. Sarah returned just then, hanging Angela her wrapped bouquet, and the conversation paused as they paid for their flowers. Outside, the rain had stopped. The three of them stepped onto the sidewalk, the fresh scent of damp earth and flowers hanging in the air. "Would you mind if we all went together to the cemetery?" Robert asked. Melanie nodded. "I'd like that." As they drove, the silence in the car was thick with unspoken questions. Angela finally turned in her seat to face Melanie. "What happened when you saw Marcia?" Melanie tightened her grip on the bouquet in her lap. She was nervous, very nervous, and there was a woman there, younger. I'd never seen her before. "A family member?" Robert asked. "No," Melanie said firmly. Marcia never had children, and the way they acted, it didn't feel like family. It felt like secrecy. "What did she say about the photo?" Angela pressed. "She first said it was taken during the trip," Melanie replied. Then she changed her story, said it was at the school before they left. Angela frowned. "That's strange. Why change the story?" "Exactly," Melanie said. "And when I asked her directly if she had gone on the trip, she denied it. But I don't believe her." Robert glanced at Melanie in the rearview mirror. Memory can be tricky after so many years. Not this, Melanie replied. It wasn't memory, it was fear. They arrived at the cemetery under a clearing sky. The clouds had parted slightly, allowing faint beams of sunlight to break through. The three of them walked slowly toward the plot, where Emily and Lily's headstones stood side by side. Melanie knelt and placed the bouquet gently against Emily's stone, brushing away a few leaves that had settled there. Her fingers lingered on the engraving, tracing the name she had memorized long ago. "It never gets easier," Angela said beside her. "But somehow it helps to come here, to do something." Melanie nodded. "It's the only place I feel like I can still talk to her." The wind picked up slightly, stirring the branches above them. As Melanie rose to her feet, she glanced toward the far end of the cemetery and froze. Near the section where several of the other children had been buried, a woman stood alone, her back to them. She was staring down at a headstone, her shoulders slightly hunched. Melanie recognized her immediately. It was the young woman from Marcia's house. Without thinking, she touched Angela's arm lightly. "I'll be right back," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Angela looked surprised but didn't protest. Melanie walked briskly across the grass, her footsteps muffled by the soft ground. As she drew closer, she could see the woman was crying, her hands clasped in front of her. "Excuse me," Melanie said gently. The woman turned, startled, her tear-streaked face paling as she recognized Melanie. "We meet again," Melanie continued, trying to keep her tone calm. "I saw you earlier, at Marcia's house." The woman looked around, clearly uncomfortable. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "I didn't mean to—" "It's okay," Melanie interrupted. "I didn't come to accuse you. I need to understand." The woman's gaze dropped. "I come here every year, on this day, to remember—" Melon's silence stretched between them. Then Melanie asked the question that had been clawing at her since their first meeting. "Who were you grieving for? Were you related to one of the children?" The woman hesitated. Her lips parted as if to speak, then closed again. Her hands trembled slightly. Melanie followed her gaze to the grave at her feet and noticed a small framed photo placed beside the headstone. She bent slightly, peering closer. Though faded with age, the image showed a young girl in a school uniform, smiling. The resemblance was undeniable. Melanie looked up. "You must have really loved your sister," she said gently. The woman turned away, wiping her eyes. Melanie took a step back. "I don't want to intrude," she said softly, "but I do want the truth." Just as she turned to leave, the woman's voice stopped her. "Wait." Melanie turned back. The woman's voice was hesitant but firm. "Why did you come to Marcia's house earlier?" Melanie paused. "Because I saw something in that photo, something that didn't make sense, and I needed answers." She reached into her bag and pulled out the now crumpled class photo. "This," she said, holding it out. The woman stared at it, her expression unreadable. Then, without warning, a small, sorrowful chuckle escaped her lips. Her eyes welled with tears. She touched one of the faces gently. "Emily," she murmured. She was such a pain, but in the best way. Melanie's breath caught. "You knew Emily?" The woman stiffened. She returned the photo, her hands shaking. "Who are you?" Melanie asked slowly. Is this you?" She pointed to the photo beside the grave. The woman's reaction was immediate. "No," she said, too quickly. But her voice betrayed her. Melanie stepped closer. "You don't have to be afraid. Are you one of the survivors?" The woman shook her head, panic flashing in her eyes. "You're mistaken," she insisted. But the truth was already written across her face. "It's you," Melanie said softly. "It's really you." The woman turned away, her shoulders sagging in defeat. "You don't want to know," she whispered. "It's better for everyone." Melanie stepped forward, her voice breaking. "Please. I've lived 27 years not knowing what happened to my daughter. If you know something, anything, I need to hear it." The woman's eyes filled again. She opened her mouth, then closed it. Then finally, after a long, aching pause, she said the words Melanie never expected to hear. "I'm Isabel Hartman. I was on that bus." Melanie stood in stunned silence, her breath caught in her throat as the words echoed between them. "I'm Isabel Hartman. I was on that bus." The world seemed to tilt slightly, and for a moment she couldn't find her voice. The grief, the confusion, the years of aching emptiness all came crashing into this one impossible moment. Isabel turned away, as if wishing she could take the confession back, but it was too late. Melanie stepped forward, her voice trembling but clear. "You're one of them. You survived." Isabel nodded slowly, her eyes never meeting Melanie's. "Yes, but I never came back. I couldn't." Melanie's mind whirled. She reached out gently, not to grab or pressure, but to ground herself in this surreal moment. "But why? Why didn't you come home? Your parents, they've grieved for you every day." Isabel's shoulders hunched. "I was broken. After everything that happened, I didn't know how to return. I didn't even feel like the same person. And then Marcia found me. She said if I told the truth, it would only make things worse for the families, that it was better for them to believe their children were gone forever than to know what we endured." Melanie felt the blood drain from her face. "Marcia knew you were alive," Isabel nodded. "She took me in, paid for my apartment, kept me hidden, but in return I had to stay quiet." Melanie's hands trembled. "That's why you were at her house today." "Yes," Isabel whispered. "She's the only one I've had for years. I didn't know who else to trust, but you can trust me," Melanie said, her voice cracking. "You have to. Isabel, I lost my daughter. I've spent 27 years not knowing what happened to her. If you know anything, please, I need to know." Isabel looked down at the framed photo she still held, her fingers trembling. She was kind to me, even when others weren't. She helped me during the first few hours after we were taken, but—" Her voice broke. "She didn't survive the first night," Melanie gasped softly, her knees threatening to give out. She took a shaky breath. "What do you mean?" "They gave us injections," Isabel said, her voice hollow, "to sedate us. Emily. She didn't react well. Her heart stopped. I think the Doge was wrong. They didn't know what they were doing." Melanie's tears came hot and fast, her heart shattering all over again. "And Lily?" she asked, barely able to form the words. Isabel's gaze flickered toward the other end of the cemetery, where Angela and Robert were still standing. "She made it a few more days," she whispered, "but she got sick, and they didn't care enough to help her." Melanie sank to her knees, sobbing into her hands. Isabel knelt beside her, reaching out hesitantly. "I'm so sorry," she said. "I've carried this for so long. I was afraid that telling the truth would just deepen the wounds." Melanie looked up, her face streaked with tears. "You've been living in silence all this time." Isabel nodded. "By it, but seeing you today, here, I realized I can't keep doing this. I need to tell someone. I need to tell the police." Melanie exhaled shakily, gripping Isabel's hand. "Yes, you have to. We need to know, all of us." Just then Angela appeared, her brow furrowed in concern. "Melanie, are you all right?" she asked, stepping closer. Robert followed, his expression serious. Melanie rose slowly, still holding Isabel's hand. "Angela, Robert, this is Isabel Hartman." Angela froze. "What?" Isabel offered a small nod. "I was one of the missing students." Angela covered her mouth with a gasp, stepping backward in shock. Robert stared, speechless. I don't understand," Angela stammered. "You're alive?" "Yes," Isabel said softly. "But it's a long story, one I want to share. I want to help." At that moment, in the distance, the sound of police sirens began to rise, faint but growing. Isabel flinched, her body instinctively tensing. "Don't run," Melanie said gently. "You're safe now. You're doing the right thing." Isabel nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I hope so." The sirens drew closer until a police cruiser pulled up near the cemetery entrance. 2 officers stepped out, scanning the area. Melanie raised her hand and waved them over. As they approached, one of them asked. Isabel stepped forward. "I did," she said. "My name is Isabel Hartman. I was one of the students who disappeared in the 1996 school trip." The officers exchanged looks, then one of them reached for his radio. "We're going to need confirmation," he said. Isabel nodded. "I understand. I'll go with you. I want to give a statement." Melanie squeezed her shoulder. "You're very brave." Angela, still stunned, looked between them. "I don't believe it. After all these years," Robert finally spoke, "this changes everything. The officers guided Isabel to their vehicle, one opening the back door while the other kept an eye on the growing group. Melanie turned to Angela. She knew about Emily, about Lily. She was there, Angela, and she's going to help us find out what really happened. Angela nodded slowly, still processing the revelation. Do you think others might still be alive? Melanie's voice was steady. I don't know, but we're finally getting closer to the truth. As the cruiser pulled away with Isabel inside, the three of them stood silently, watching it disappear into the road beyond the trees. For the first time in nearly 3 decades, they had a direction, a witness, a survivor, and a chance to finally learn what happened on that bus. The ride to the police station was quiet, tense, and thick with the weight of unspoken emotions. Melanie, Angela, and Robert followed closely behind the squad car in Robert's vehicle, each of them staring out their respective windows in silence. Melanie's thoughts spun like a carousel stuck at full speed. Isabel Hartman. A name carved into a tombstone, a face lost in time, now suddenly alive, real, and carrying the unbearable burden of a truth Melanie wasn't sure she was ready to hear. But she had to hear it. They all did. When they arrived at the station, Officer Jensen, gray-haired now, his presence still solid, was waiting near the entrance. He looked up from his clipboard and blinked in recognition as Melanie stepped out of the car. Mrs. Harrington, he said, his voice filled with surprise and something akin to respect. This is about the field trip case, isn't it? He asked, glancing toward the cruiser where Isabel was being escorted inside. Melanie nodded. Who says she was there? One of the missing kids. Isabel's Hartman. Officer Jensen's jaw tightened. If she is who she says she is, this changes everything. Moments later, Isabel was led into an interrogation room. Melanie, Angela, and Robert were asked to remain in the waiting area. The room was sterile, walls painted in cold shades of gray, the chairs as uncomfortable as the memories they stirred. Angela paced. Robert sat rigidly, hands clasped. Melanie stared at the door Isabel had gone through, willing herself to be patient. Time dragged. Officers moved briskly around them, voices low, phones ringing, papers shuffling, then a shift. The air changed. One of the officers emerged, leaned toward another, whispered something urgent. Suddenly, a flurry of motion began. Officers moved with purpose. Orders were given. And then they heard it. Clear, deliberate, chilling. A unit to the residence of Marcia Daniels. Bring her in. Melanie's heart skipped a beat. She exchanged a stunned look with Angela. She confessed, Angela whispered. She must have told them everything. They waited, breath held collectively, until almost an hour later the front doors of the station opened again. In came Marcia Daniels, hands cuffed behind her back, flanked by 2 officers. Her face was pale, eyes downcast, shoulders slumped beneath the weight of exposure. She was no longer the composed principal from earlier that day. She looked like a person stripped of all pretense. Melanie stood instinctively, her body pulled forward by years of pain and the jarring sight of this woman who had once smiled at parent meetings, who had stood behind a podium and delivered eulogies. Now she was walking through a hallway of judgment, her steps echoing louder than her words ever had. As Marcia passed, her eyes briefly lifted and locked with Melanie's. "I'm sorry," she whispered, barely audible, before being pushed forward and out of sight. Melanie sat back down, her limbs trembling. She didn't feel vindicated. Not yet. There was too much left unsaid, too many holes in the fabric of the past. Finally, an officer approached. "Would you like to hear the details?" Melanie nodded quickly, as did Angela and Robert. They were ushered into a separate room where Officer Jensen waited, papers in hand, his face grave. "Isabel's testimony has begun to confess. What you're about to hear is disturbing." Melanie braced herself. Angela reached out and took her hand. Jensen began. Marcia Daniels was responsible for planning the school trip. What she didn't tell anyone was that she was deeply in debt. Apparently, she'd been targeted by a human trafficking network operating across the Mexican border. They offered her a way out, money enough to cover her debts and protect her family. In exchange for delivering children, Melanie's stomach churned. She framed the teacher, Mr. Thompson, to make it look like he was the one in charge. Jensen continued. She even went so far as to manipulate the documents and ensure he was the only staff member listed on the itinerary. The day of the trip, the bus never made it to the park. It was diverted. Angela's breath caught. What happened to the kids? Jensen's voice lowered. They were taken across the border. The boys were sold into child labor in overseas factories. The girls were targeted for exploitation by organized crime groups. Melanie let out a quiet cry, covering her mouth with her hand. Jensen looked at her gently. Isabel confirmed Emily and Lily were among the first casualties. The criminals administering the sedatives made mistakes. Dosages were inconsistent. They didn't care. There were no second chances. Robert looked away, jaw clenched. Angela sobbed quietly beside Melanie, who was frozen, her mind trying to process the horror. Isabel managed to escape 12 years ago, Jensen continued. She's lived in hiding, under Marcia's protection, or rather, her manipulation. Maria convinced her that if she spoke up, it would only cause more suffering. Melanie felt the weight of those words settle on her chest, like a stone. Isabel wants to cooperate fully. With her statement and Marcia's confession, we are reopening the case and coordinating with Mexican authorities to track down the network responsible. We're also investigating to determine if any of the other students might have survived. Will Isabel be safe? We're placing her under witness protection, Jensen confirmed. Her life may still be in danger, but she's willing to help. She wants justice. Melanie nodded, barely able to contain the flood of emotions inside her. She looked toward the door, hoping to see Isabel again. Moments later, Isabel emerged, pale and exhausted, but no longer hiding. Melanie stood and embraced her tightly. "Thank you," she whispered. "For being brave, for speaking up." Isabel hugged her back, her voice trembling. "I'm sorry I couldn't save Emily. I tried." "You survived," Melanie said softly. "And now, because of you, we might find the others. We might stop this from ever happening again." Angela joined them, wrapping her arms around both women. Robert stood a step behind, wiping at his eyes. Outside, the sun had almost set, casting long golden shadows across the parking lot. The day had begun with grief and uncertainty. It ended with truth. Painful, horrifying truth, but truth nonetheless. And in that, there was a beginning. A crack of light in a world long consumed by darkness. And Melanie Harrington, for the first time in 27 years, felt something she had almost forgotten. Hope. The following days were a whirlwind of movement, investigation, and media speculation. Word of Isabel Hartman's reappearance and the dramatic arrest of former principal Marcia Daniels spread quickly, drawing renewed attention to a case long considered cold and unsolvable. News vans began to crowd outside the police station, and reporters hovered around the courthouse steps, hungry for every scrap of new information. But for Melanie, Angela, and the small circle of families still clinging to memory and mourning, the media frenzy was secondary to the tidal wave of emotions crashing into their lives. Inside the police station, Isabel was relocated to a secure witness room, guarded at all times. She underwent more interviews, this time with federal officers, child trafficking specialists, and psychologists trained to support survivors of extreme trauma. Melanie visited every day she was allowed, not as a mother demanding answers, but as a woman offering quiet solidarity. Isabel's emotional walls were beginning to lower. Each day her voice grew a little stronger, her shoulders a little less tense. One afternoon, as Melanie sat with her in the small sunlit room used for witness counseling, Isabel pulled out a folded map. It was crude, hand-drawn, edges frayed and smudged. "This is where they took us," she said quietly, pointing to a region just beyond the Mexican border. There was a compound, surrounded by fencing, armed guards. "I don't know if it's still active, but this is where they kept us." Melanie leaned in, her eyes scanning the map. "Did the others? Were any of them still alive when you escaped?" Isabel's gaze grew distant. Her son were. "I was separated from most of the girls after the first year. They moved us constantly. But I remember a few names, faces. There was a boy named Tyler Jensen. He used to sing lullabies to the younger kids to keep them calm. And Katie Sullivan. She could draw anything, even without seeing it first. I think some of them survived longer than me." Melanie reached out, squeezing Isabel's hand. "Then we'll find them. Or at least try. You've already done the impossible by speaking out." Meanwhile, Marcia Daniels' confession deepened. In a closed hearing with federal prosecutors, she admitted to orchestrating the children's disappearances with the help of traffickers to erase debts she had hidden for years. She detailed how the plan was to make it look like a tragic accident, one that left no trace. The teacher, Mr. Thompson, had been her scapegoat. He had refused to go along with the plan once he realized what was happening, and for that he was killed. His body was never found. When Melanie learned this, she wept anew, not just for Emily, but for Mr. Thompson and for the injustice his family had endured. Angela, too, was shaken. All these years, I thought he might have been guilty, and he was just another victim. At a press conference organized by the police, Melanie and Angela were invited to speak. Standing before cameras and microphones, Melanie held a photo of Emily. Her voice didn't waver. For 27 years we lived in darkness. We lived to know if our children suffered, if they were alone, or if they cried out for us. Today, thanks to Isabel's courage, we finally have some light. My daughter Emily is gone, but her story, her truth, deserves to be told. And we will not stop until every child who vanished that day is accounted for, one way or another. The room silent after her words, the impact heavy and raw. That same evening, Melanie received a call from Officer Jensen. "We have something," he said. "Isabel's map matches satellite data from a former cartel outpost in the region she described. We're coordinating with Mexican authorities to raid the location." Melanie felt her breath catch. Do you think someone might still be there?" "It's possible," he replied. "We don't know what we'll find, but it's our best lead in decades." Days later, an international raid was carried out. The site, overgrown with weeds and partly abandoned, was surrounded by armed officers and UN observers. What they found was chilling. Remnants of bunk-style dormitories, broken children's belongings, tiny shoes, hair ribbons, toys, some dating back nearly 30 years. Most heartbreaking was a wall of names scratched into wooden planks, some with dates, others just initials. Isabel had been right. Children had been held here, lived here, some died here, others had been moved. "She never went anywhere without that toy," she whispered, "even that day." Isabel sat beside her, her eyes glassy. "I remember her holding it when the bus was taken. She was trying to keep Lily calm." Melanie reached out and took Isabel's hand again. "You gave me that memory back. It's painful, but it's real. It's mine again." Federal agents promised to continue searching using DNA records, international cooperation, and testimonies to uncover the fates of the other children. For the first time, there was a path forward, murky, painful, but real. Isabel was offered a chance to testify in front of a grand jury, and she accepted. "I want to speak for all of us," she told Melanie one night as they sat watching the sun dip behind the courthouse dome. "Not just the ones who are gone, but the ones who might still be waiting to be found." Melanie smiled, the first real smile in a long time, "and I'll be right there with you." As they prepared for the hearing, media interest surged again, but this time Melanie didn't shy away. She wanted the world to know who Emily was, who Lily had been, who Isabel had become. They were no longer just names on a list. They were the daughters of a nation that had failed them and now owed them justice. And as the courtroom doors prepared to open, as Isabel stood tall and unflinching beside the mothers who had never stopped hoping, Melanie felt something shift within her. Not closure, no, that was too simple a word, but maybe something stronger. A promise that the past would no longer be buried, that the truth would no longer be silenced, and that justice, even after 27 years, still had a voice. The courtroom buzzed with a tense kind of silence, the kind that settles over a place moments before history is made. Reporters sat shoulder to shoulder behind ropes, their notepads ready, microphones aimed. The gallery was filled with faces both familiar and foreign, families of the other missing children, officials from both the U.S. and Mexican governments, advocates against child trafficking, and survivors of other long-buried horrors. At the center of it all stood Isabel Hartman. Dressed modestly in a navy blouse and dark jeans, her hair pulled back in a simple braid, she looked neither like a victim nor a witness, but something in between. Strong, but carrying the visible scars of a story the world was only beginning to hear. Melanie and Angela sat in the front row, just behind the prosecution table, their presence unwavering. When Isabel entered, she didn't look at the media or the attorneys. Her eyes immediately sought out Melanie's. And for a brief second, They shared a look that spoke of trust, courage, and the long road that had brought them here. The judge, a solemn woman in her early 60s, called the room to order. We are gathered to hear the sworn testimony of Miss Isabel Hartman in the matter concerning the disappearance of 15 schoolchildren in 1996 and the criminal charges against Marcia Daniels, currently in federal custody. Miss Hartman, you may proceed. Isabel stood, took a breath, and stepped to the microphone. My name is Isabel Hartman, she began, and I was on the school bus that left Flagstaff, Arizona on October 2nd, 1996. The room was dead silent. Even the shuffling of paper and murmurs from the press ceased. We were supposed to be going to Grand Canyon National Park, she continued. It was supposed to be fun, a break from school, but the bus never made it. We were intercepted on a service road by a black van. The bus driver, Mr. Lewis, he was shot. I remember the sound. I remember screaming. The last thing I saw before passing out was Emily Harrington trying to shield one of the younger boys. Angela gripped her friend's arm, holding her steady. Isabel went on, her voice growing firmer with each word. We woke up. We were in a compound, a walled, dirt-floored enclosure with bunk beds made of steel and chains on the doors. Some of us were taken right away, the girls mostly, others were for health. But I saw what they did. Emily, she gave us shots, said they were for health, but I saw what they did. Emily, she didn't survive the first night. Her body went limp hours after the injection. They said she had a weak heart. They didn't care. They dragged her away in a black tarp. I never saw her again. Melanie wept openly now, her body shaking. But she didn't look away. She owed that to her daughter, to witness the truth at last. We were separated by gender after that. The boys were sold to factories in Asia and Eastern Europe. The girls were exploited in ways I can't describe without breaking, Isabel said. Her voice, faltering for a second, kept us moving. Every few months, new handlers, new places. I escaped when I was 19 after faking illness and sneaking away from a safe house. I found my way back to Arizona. That's when Marcia Daniels found me. Gasps filled the room. She convinced me not to go to the police. She said it would destroy the families, that giving them the truth would only make their suffering worse. I believed her. For too long, I believed her. Glasses. Miss Hartman, did Marcia Daniels ever directly admit her involvement? Yes, Isabel answered. She told me she organized the entire thing to erase her debts, that she arranged the route change and coordinated with the traffickers. She called it a necessary sacrifice. That phrase hung in the air like smoke. Necessary sacrifice. A few parents in the courtroom began sobbing. Others sat stone-faced, absorbing the magnitude of betrayal. As the testimony ended, the courtroom erupted, not with noise, but with raw, guttural silence, the kind that follows a revelation too heavy for words. Later that afternoon, Marcia Daniels appeared briefly for a bail hearing. She looked aged beyond recognition, her once blonde hair now fully gray, her posture shrunken. The judge denied bail and ordered her held without release until trial. Melanie watched as Marcia was led away in shackles. There was no vindictive satisfaction, only sorrow. The system had failed them for decades, but now, at least, accountability had begun. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed for statements. Melanie stepped to the microphone, not as a grieving mother, but as a voice for all those still waiting. We were told for years that our children simply vanished, that there was no trail, no hope, no answers. That lie ends today. Isabel Hartman has given us the most painful gift imaginable, the truth. And now, with that truth, we will fight for justice, for recovery, for every child stolen and every family broken. That evening, as twilight fell over the quiet neighborhoods of Flagstaff, Melanie sat on her porch, a cup of tea in her hand, and the photo of Emily beside her. The scent of lavender drifted from her garden. She was not at peace, not yet. But she was no longer drowning. Angela joined her, sitting without words. After a few minutes, Melanie spoke. She was so brave. Isabel, I don't think I could have done it. Angela nodded. You already did. For 27 years you kept hope alive. That's a kind of bravery, too. The stars began to blink into view above them, one by one. Melanie looked up, then down at Emily's photo. "I think she'd be proud," she said softly. "She is," Angela whispered. "They both are, and in that quiet space, surrounded by memory, pain, and the faint glimmer of justice finally awakening, the two mothers sat shoulder to shoulder, heart to heart, knowing that though the road ahead remained long, they no longer had to walk it alone. In the weeks following Isabel's testimony, the once quiet town of Flagstaff became a nexus of justice, memory, and reckoning. Federal agencies, supported by international organizations, launched a full-scale investigation into the transnational trafficking ring that had stolen 15 children all those years ago. Authorities across borders coordinated with a level of urgency not seen in decades. Arrests were made in Tijuana, Ciudad Juarez, and small border towns that had served as waypoints in the children's tragic journey. Old records were unearthed, names cross-referenced, and former cartel affiliates brought in for questioning. The more they dug, the clearer it became that what had happened in 1996 was not an isolated incident, but part of a larger, more sinister network that had operated undetected for years. Yet even amidst the bureaucratic chaos and expanding legal web, the emotional core remained, with the families who had lost everything. Melanie spent her days traveling between the courthouse, the police station, and quiet community meetings organized for the families of the victims. Angela was by her side for most of them, along with Robert and a handful of others who had also been trapped in this decades-long limbo. One particular meeting stood out. Held in the basement of the old Civic Center, it was intimate, with folding chairs arranged in a circle. No press, no cameras, just the families, some holding framed photos, others wearing memorial pins. A soft-spoken woman named Teresa stood up, her hands trembling as she held a laminated school photo. "My son's name was Jordan," she said. "He was 8, the youngest on that bus. I always wondered if he even knew what was happening." Melanie reached across the circle and took her hand. "We're scared," she said softly. "But they had each other, Emily." She tried to protect the others. Isabel said she comforted the smaller kids. Teresa sobbed, but there was a strange peace in her tears, as if just knowing that her son hadn't suffered alone gave her something solid to hold on to. The meeting became a space for release, not just of pain, but of stories that had never been told. Fathers spoke for the first time in public. Siblings of the victims shared how their own lives had been shaped by silence and grief. And for once, they weren't being told to move on. They were being invited to speak, to remember, and to heal. Meanwhile, Isabel remained under federal protection, her identity known now to the public, but her location kept confidential. She continued to provide detailed accounts of what she remembered, including sketches of the people involved, schedules they were forced to follow, even names overheard in whispered conversations. Her bravery had become a catalyst. Survivors of similar trafficking cases began reaching out, and a task force was established to link Isabel's case to others around the country. A new cold case unit was funded specifically to reinvestigate long-forgotten disappearances. Yet despite all this movement, Melanie found herself most changed, not by the external developments, but by a growing sense of internal transformation. For the first time in nearly 3 decades, she wasn't consumed by questions with no answers. Now she had fragments of truth. They were painful, horrific even, but they were real. And reality, however cruel, was something she could build on. One chilly afternoon, as autumn leaves began to gather in orange and red swirls on her porch, Isabel came to visit under tight security. Melanie welcomed her inside like family, ushering her toward the kitchen where the scent of cinnamon tea filled the air. They sat at the same table where Melanie had once sat alone with photos and grief. Now, across from her, was a young woman who had survived the very thing that had haunted those images. "I keep seeing her," Isabel admitted quietly. "In dreams. Sometimes I'm back in the compound, and she's there sitting next to me, humming something soft. It's not a nightmare. It's more like she's visiting me." Melanie smiled through her tears. "That sounds like her. She used to hum when she drew. Never sang the words, just the tune." Isabel looked up, her eyes shimmering. "I'm scared I'll forget, that as time passes, the faces will blur, the names will slip away." Melanie reached across the table and placed a hand over Isabel's. "You won't, because you're not carrying them alone anymore. We're here now, all of us. Isabel nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you for believing me, for helping me come forward. You gave us a gift we never thought we'd get," Melanie replied. "The truth." Later that week, Melanie and Angela were invited to Washington, D.C. to testify before a congressional committee. They stood before senators and representatives, their voices calm, firm, and unwavering. Suddenly, he had another thought, and a new skill. We are witnesses to the consequences of silence. For too long, cases like ours were dismissed as untraceable. But they weren't. They just weren't prioritized. That changes now. Their words were met with solemn applause, and afterward legislative aides swarmed with questions, eager to translate emotion into action. A bill was drafted, the Child Justice Recovery Act, proposing expanded funding for trafficking investigations, survivor support services, and mandatory reevaluation of all cold missing persons cases involving children over the past 40 years. Back in Flagstaff, a memorial service was held, not a funeral, but a remembrance. In a field near the old elementary school, a sculpture was unveiled. It featured 15 birds taking flight from a single open cage, their wings carved from different metals, bronze, copper, silver, each one etched with the names of the missing children. Melanie stood before the sculpture, her hand resting on the name Melanie Harrington. "You're free now," she whispered, "and so are we." The crowd around her included teachers, neighbors, and strangers who had followed the story. Candles were lit, songs were sung, and as dusk settled over the town, a new kind of silence emerged, not born from fear or absence, but from reverence. As the service ended, Isabel stepped to the microphone. She paused for a long moment, then said simply, "We survived, and now we live for them." The crowd erupted in gentle applause. Tears mingled with smiles, and for the first time in 27 years, Flagstaff felt whole again. Scarred, yes, but no longer broken. Months passed, and while the headlines gradually shifted to new stories and the media trucks disappeared from the streets of Flagstaff, the ripples of what had happened did not fade. They deepened. In the quiet spaces of homes, classrooms, and council halls, the echoes of the vanished children remained. But now, those echoes were accompanied by something else. Voices that refused to forget, voices that demanded justice, voices that refused to forget. Melanie continued her advocacy work, now part of a national coalition formed in the wake of Isabel's testimony. The coalition, composed of survivors, family members, and child protection experts, traveled to schools, law enforcement agencies, and judicial conferences, urging reform, awareness, and compassion in handling missing persons cases. Angela often joined her, their bond stronger than ever, fortified by tragedy but fueled by shared healing. They visited other parents whose cases had once been shelved, sharing what they had learned, how to pressure institutions with kindness and persistence, how to search for clues without being consumed by them, and most importantly, how to hold on to hope without letting it hollow them out. One crisp December morning, Melanie received a letter, not an email or a text, but a real handwritten letter. The envelope was plain, with no return address, but the handwriting was careful, the ink slightly faded. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened it. Inside was a single sheet of lined paper. It read, "Mrs. Harrington, my name is Luca Morales. I believe I was one of the boys taken on the 1996 bus trip. I saw your story on the news. I remember the cage. I remember the compound. I remember Emily. She gave me her bread once when I hadn't eaten in 2 days. I survived because of people like her. I don't know if I'm ready to come forward yet, but I want you to know. You helped me remember that I'm not alone, that my story matters. Thank you." Melanie's breath caught as she clutched the paper to her chest. Tears slipped down her cheeks, not from pain this time, but from awe. Against all odds, another survivor had surfaced, not because of fear or guilt, but because of the truth that had been spoken aloud, finally, after so long. She shared the letter with Isabel and Angela that evening over tea. Isabel read it twice, her hand shaking slightly. "He remembers Emily," she whispered. "She saved him. Even in her final moments, she was saving someone's." Melanie nodded, her voice thick with emotion. "She was always like that, always watching out for the others." Angela placed her hand over Melanie's. And now she's still saving people through you. That winter, the first stone was laid for a new center in Flagstaff, the Melanie Harrington Child Recovery and Advocacy Center. Funded through federal grants and private donations, it would provide counseling, legal aid, investigative resources, and shelter for survivors of trafficking and exploitation. Isabel agreed to serve as one of the program directors, her name now not just known, but respected. She had become a symbol of endurance, not a tragic figure, but a torchbearer. The groundbreaking ceremony drew hundreds, many of them strangers who had followed the story, others who had once been silent but now felt called to step forward. As Melanie cut the ribbon with shaking hands, she looked toward the sky, where the sun broke through the winter clouds in streaks of gold. "This is for you, Emily," she whispered, "for all of you." On the anniversary of the children's disappearance the following year, the town of Flagstaff held a candlelight vigil at the sculpture site. Each family placed a candle beneath the bird that bore their child's name. The ceremony was quiet, reverent, and deeply moving. As the sun set behind the mountains, one by one, the birds were illuminated by small ground lanterns, their wings shimmering like beacons in the twilight. Melanie stood with Robert and Angela, Isabel beside them, now no longer under protection, but free. Luca Morales had written again, this time confirming he had entered therapy and was working with law enforcement to provide testimony about his captors. He hadn't returned to Flagstaff yet, but he had asked that a candle be lit in his name, his light joining the others. Melanie placed it herself, whispering a prayer she didn't need words to finish. After the ceremony, Melanie and Isabel walked slowly through the rows of candles. "I used to think peace meant forgetting," Isabel said quietly, "that it only came when you let go of the pain." "I thought that too," Melanie replied, "but peace isn't forgetting. It's learning how to carry the truth and still walk forward." They paused in front of the bird bearing Emily's name. "She would have been 34 this year," Melanie whispered. "I try to imagine who she would have become." Isabel smiled softly. "She would have been amazing. I think she already was." Melanie took a deep breath, the cool air filling her lungs, clean and sharp. "You know, I still expect to hear her voice sometimes, like she'll call from another room. That hasn't gone away?" Isabel nodded. "Maybe it never will, but maybe that's okay." As they turned back toward the crowd, toward the soft sound of music and murmurs of conversation, Melanie felt a quiet settle in her chest. Not silence, not absence, but space, where grief could exist alongside gratitude, where sorrow could make room for strength. The pain would never leave completely, but neither would the love, and that love, fiercely remembered and courageously shared, had sparked something larger than any of them. A movement, a monument, a mission. The darkness that had swallowed 15 children 28 years ago had not won. It had been pulled into the light by the steady hands of those who refused to give up, who refused to look away, and who dared to believe that even the most shattered stories could still be finished, with truth, with justice, and with grace. If this story moved you, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel for more true inspired mystery narratives. Which part of the story stayed with you the most? Do you think Melanie made the right decision confronting Principal Daniels? And what are your thoughts on Isabel's bravery? Let us know your thoughts in the comments and tell us where in the world you're watching from. We always love hearing your perspectives.